Hold up your hand if you've been to one of these conferences more than, say, 6 or 8 years ago. So this is number 15. I've been to almost all of them. So many of you would have been familiar with Jim Hecker, who was also with Husch Blackwell, and at the time, as was I, had been a frequent speaker at this conference. And so we're really pleased today to have Linda Walsh, who is also with the Washington, D.C. office of Husch Blackwell, and one of the other people that specializes in FERC and in issues like this. And she's here to talk with us today about the interconnection and the queue reform that FERC has recently, announced, and issued regulations on to try and help us through. And as I always tell people, one of the things that we suffer through a little bit today in the renewable energy industry, and particularly in Nebraska, but in SPP generally, it's you've heard that term, an embarrassment of riches. Well, we do have this great resource in Nebraska, and one of the downsides of that means we have lots of different projects that have to be worked through. And Linda's going to talk about how this new order might help work through some of that. So with that, Linda Walsh.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here. Happy to see everyone. FERC's Order 2023. The 2023 is for the year, the current year. The last time FERC issued a comprehensive reform of the interconnection process was in 2003, and they titled that Order 2003. So maybe 20 years from now, we'll see a 2043. Who knows? But this current order is it was issued this past summer, and it is geared toward increasing the speed of the queue, making it more efficient, and incorporating new technologies. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so there's the site to the order if it's on FERC website, or I'm happy to send a copy out if anyone needs a copy. The Order 2003, it reforms the pro forma large generator interconnection agreement and the large generator interconnection procedures, as well as the small generator interconnection procedures and the small generator interconnection agreement. These were pro formas that were developed in Order 2003. They're now revised in Order 2023. As I mentioned, the key reforms are to address the backlogs. As you all know, that most queues in the country have a huge backlog of projects waiting to go through the queue. And also today we'll discuss the compliance timeline that FERC has set out, which, as I'll talk about later, is subject to a lot of change because there are a lot of requests to extend compliance deadlines. And so those are sort of up in the air right now. And then there are a whole host of challenges to the current rule. FERC has pending about 30 separate requests for rehearing, and there are several appeals that have been filed in the courts, federal circuit courts. As you probably all know, many regions have already moved away from the Order 2003 pro forma. Order 2003 had a serial process for taking interconnection requests one at a time. A lot of regions, SPP, MISO, PJM, have moved to some form of a cluster study where they study groups of projects at a time. This is an attempt to move the queue faster. A lot of the regions are essentially ahead of FERC. FERC is just sort of catching up with these reforms. But these reforms apply across the board to not only RTOs, but to non-RTO transmission providers, some of whom are still back using the Order 2003 processes. For regions that have moved past the Order 2003, FERC will allow some flexibility, as we'll talk about as they go along. So there may not be wholesale changes in many regions. So the three key reforms in the final rule, and we'll take each one separate, but just to give you a broad sense of what they are, the new rule implements a first ready, first served cluster study process. So just because you're in the queue first doesn't mean you're ready, doesn't mean you're going to be the first served. There'll be a cluster study. You'll be grouped with a bunch of other generators, all given the same queue position, and move forward with studies in that fashion. And then the rule also requires measures to increase the speed of the queue. And this is, I guess I would say, the most controversial aspect of the rule, because it imposes study deadlines and financial penalties on transmission providers who don't meet the study deadlines. And finally, the last key reform is that the rule incorporates technological advancements into the interconnection process, because a lot has changed since Order 2003, and there's a lot of new technologies out there that FERC would like to see accommodated better in the process. So the first key reform is the cluster study process. The first part of this is that FERC is trying to remedy a problem that has, to some extent, led to the huge number of projects in the queue. And that is, in some regions anyway, the only way to get information is to make an interconnection request to get into the queue, and then you can get information about the feasibility of a project. So FERC is requiring transmission providers to make information available, publicly available, before generators have to submit an interconnection request. And they're requiring it in the form of an interactive heat map. And this will be a way for potential interconnection customers to get information without having to make an interconnection request. The heat maps will have to be updated regularly. There are all kinds of requirements in the rule for those heat maps. This is also somewhat controversial, which I'll discuss later, because there's a lot of rehearings on the heat map issue as well. So for the cluster study process, and I'll just go over this briefly. There are a lot of deadlines, a lot of windows, a lot of time periods for studies, but basically a high-level overview of the cluster study process is that all requests have to be submitted in a window. It's a 45-day window, and all of those projects submitted in that window will have the same queue position. So if you're the first one in that window or the last one, you all have the same queue position. The transmission provider will have 5 business days, to let you know if there's a deficiency in your request. And then you'll have 10 days to remedy the deficiency. And so given that it's a 45-day window, 5 business days to get notified of a deficiency, and 10 business days to cure the deficiency, that's about 3 weeks. So if you want to have the full 10 days to respond to a deficiency, you need to get your interconnection request in by like the 24th day or so of the window. Otherwise, you may fall short on the, I'm sorry, excuse me? Oh, sorry. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. So you don't want to fall short of the full 10 days to remedy a deficiency. For example, if you were to file your inter request on day 40, you may not even get a notice of a deficiency, and then you're out. You'll be kicked out of the queue. You have to wait for the next window. And then the cluster study timeframes. These are transmission provider timeframes, and these are the timeframes that they'll be penalized if they don't meet those timeframes. So in the rule, FERC has proposed some allocation methods for the cluster study costs and for the cost of network upgrades. So think you have we have a cluster study, you have a group of generators all participating in the same study. And so FERC has proposed to give transmission providers, TP means transmission provider, shorthand, some flexibility to allocate those study costs within some parameters. So between 90 and 50% of the study costs have to be allocated pro rata, meaning based on size of the generator, and between 10 and 50% based on the number of projects that are in that particular cluster. For allocating network upgrade costs, now those are big costs, FERC is requiring that the proportional impact method be used. And that means the transmission provider has to determine the individual generator's contribution to the need for the upgrades. And that's how they'll allocate the cost of the network upgrades. So if you have a project that does not contribute to the need for an upgrade, you may not get assigned any network upgrade costs, even though the cluster as a whole may have some network upgrade costs assigned. The one thing that FERC declined to do was to share network upgrade costs between clusters. So if you have the first cluster, network upgrades are built, second cluster comes along, benefits from those network upgrades, the second cluster doesn't have to contribute to the cost of those. Even though it may sound fair to require everyone who benefits to pay, FERC found that it was just a little bit too difficult to manage that kind of an allocation process. And FERC, of course, will allow regional flexibility. A lot of, especially RTOs, have allocation methods in place currently for allocating network upgrades. Some of those may stay the same. They may not change at all, especially if they are region specific and if they've been working for the RTO. The FERC will give some flexibility to those regions. So sorry for all the busyness on this slide. This is shows you the financial commitments that will be required and readiness requirements for generators. And this is part of FERC's goal, is to make it more difficult for speculative projects and make it more likely that projects that enter the queue are going to go all the way through and complete a project. So study deposits, based on the size of a project, they can get pretty hefty, those fees. Site control will be required. 90% site control will have to be shown for the cluster and recluster and the cluster restudies, and 100% for the interconnection facilities study. A deposit, meaning a monetary deposit in lieu of site control, is going to be strictly limited. Only where a customer can demonstrate a regulatory limitation, then that could be a federal, state, tribal, or local law that makes it infeasible to get site control within the time frames prescribed in the rules. The deposits for the commercial readiness, as you can see, they quickly accelerate. 2 times the study costs at the cluster study stage, and they go all the way up to 20% of the network upgrades by the network upgrade stage. And importantly, there's no withdrawal penalty. Well, there are withdrawal penalties, but there won't be a penalty if the interconnection customer that's withdrawing doesn't have a material impact on the cluster. And so while FERC didn't really explain what they meant by material impact, this is a source of rehearings as well, and it may be decided at some point on rehearing what FERC intends by no material impact. There's also no withdrawal penalties if between the time of a cluster study and the feasibility studies, the cost of the network upgrades vastly increases. So if you're an interconnection customer and you get your facility study back and suddenly it's huge increase in your network upgrade responsibility, you may be able to withdraw at that point without a penalty. So transition process, because many queues currently are backlogged, a lot of delays. In some areas, projects have been in the queue for years, and for transmission providers to go right into a cluster study if they don't already have that process in place, that means they'd have to carry all of these older projects into that new process. So FERC is proposing a transition process so that existing interconnection customers, interconnection requests can be processed on a transition basis. Now, this transition process isn't required if transmission providers already have a cluster study process in place, which, as I said, really includes almost all of the RTOs and some non-RTOs as well. The interconnection customers who are currently in the queue have some options, 3 options. They can transition to a serial interconnection facility study. They can transition to a cluster study, the second option there, or they can withdraw without a penalty. And these options are available depending on when the interconnection customer or where they are in the process, current process of the interconnection process. Now, this whole timing is very confusing. It's the transition process itself is geared off of the transmission provider's compliance filings with the rule, which currently that date is December 5th, and I'll talk more about the timeline, but that could move. So this transmission process would have to move with that. So it's kind of hard to know exactly how much time existing interconnection requests have to decide what to do. Or to determine where they are in the process to decide what to do. But at a minimum, and if you just consider the December 5th compliance filing date, if that doesn't change, current interconnection customers will have about 120 days after the rule's effective date. Now, the rule became effective in November, so they'll have until March to figure out what to do about a transmission process. But given the requirements and the FERC's desire to essentially clear the queue, this transition process, FERC is hoping will reduce the size of current queues. Otherwise, if you don't withdraw and you go forward, then you'll be facing some withdrawal penalties. And so once this transition process then concludes, then the transmission provider will begin with its first Order 2003 cluster study. And that probably won't be until 2025 is my guess, somewhere in that time frame. And again, that's for regions that don't already have a process in place because they may not do any kind of a transition at all. So the next key reform, as I mentioned earlier, was measures to increase the speed of the queue processing. And there's sort of 3 aspects of this reform. FERC has developed an affected system study process. An affected system is a system that you're not directly connecting to, but is affected by your interconnection. So you want to connect to transmission provider number 1, but that connection will affect transmission provider number 2. And so number 2 would be an affected system. And the current rules don't have much of a process. Order 2003 did not spell out any specific process or agreements or anything. So FERC is adding that now into 2023. Some regions already have pro forma agreements. They already have a process. Likely those will stay the same, maybe revised slightly. The second measure is the elimination of the reasonable effort standard. That is where the transmission providers were allowed to complete studies based on their reasonable efforts to complete them. And some meet the deadlines and some don't. To address ones that don't meet the deadlines, FERC is proposing study delay penalties, and we'll talk about those a little bit in more detail. First, the affected system study process. The rule requires standard, uniform process, set timeframes for notifying an affected system, and for the affected system to decide when to study, what to study, how to study. The FERC has specified that the affected system is meant to use the energy resource interconnection service model, which has caused some controversy on rehearing, but we'll see if that stays the same. New pro forma agreements are required. A study agreement, a multi-party affected study agreement, and if multiple parties are involved, and a facilities construction agreement, assuming that facilities are required on that affected system. The one thing FERC didn't do, which has also caused some complaints, is that the affected system's decision on whether or not to study an interconnection request is not subject to penalty. So if there's a delay in that decision, there's no penalty, but that could hold up a lot of things. And so there's a lot of complaint about that aspect. Elimination of the reasonable efforts standard. So like I said, currently transmission providers are required to use reasonable efforts to meet deadlines. FERC is requiring firm deadlines, but the deadlines can be extended by mutual agreement, whatever that means. So it remains to be seen whether or not that's a mechanism for transmission providers to extend deadlines. If it's a cluster, it seems to me the whole cluster would have to agree to an extension, or it wouldn't be an agreement. The study delay penalties are pretty hefty. These apply per business day, and they get larger as you get further down in the queue process. The penalties that are collected are turned back to interconnection customers, either to offset study costs or offset upgrade costs. They have to be turned back in 45 days. But the transmission providers can appeal the penalties. And I'll talk later on about the rehearing requests and some of the arguments that the transmission providers are making. But the transmission providers can appeal to FERC to get a study penalty waived. For example, if a transmission provider, the study's delayed because of an interconnection customer, there was something that wasn't provided, or there was an emergency or whatever, FERC can appeal to FERC. But in the general way, these penalties are assessed regardless of fault, and it's up to the transmission provider to then go back and show that it wasn't their fault, it was somebody else's fault. And how that process will unfold remains to be seen, because it's really a factual question, and it could result in a lot of litigation or hearings at FERC as to who's responsible for delays. RTOs, some are nonprofits, and so they're complaining. They're arguing that they don't have any mechanism to collect penalties, and so FERC is allowing flexibility for RTOs to propose a method for collecting RTO-wide in a charge, or somehow distributed through the RTO members. That remains to be seen. NERC penalties are sort of dealt that way. RTOs have mechanisms to collect RTO NERC penalties, and so maybe they will follow that same pattern. So the third reform that we talked about earlier is to incorporate technological advancements into the interconnection process. And there are three basic ways that FERC is requiring technological advancements to be incorporated. And that's increasing flexibility for generators at the request stage and throughout the process, requiring transmission providers to evaluate alternative technologies in the interconnection process in the studies, and requiring modeling and performance requirements for non-synchronous generators. So increasing flexibility, here's some of the ways that the FERC rule requires transmission providers to give generators more flexibility. More than one facility can co-locate at a shared site, share a single interconnection request. They can add a facility to an existing interconnection request under some circumstances if it doesn't affect the service level. Surplus interconnection service can be requested earlier than it can be now. And interconnection customers can request that studies use more accurate modeling data and more accurate assumptions in the studies. So these are things that may have been considered a material modification under the current Order 2003 rules. So these are ways that FERC will allow some flexibility without it being considered a material modification, which, under the current process could set you backwards in the queue. Evaluating alternative technologies. So here's a list of the kinds of technologies that FERC requires that transmission providers evaluate. Now, they don't have to use them, but they have to evaluate them. And how much they evaluate, how well they evaluate, that remains to be seen. But FERC's rationale is that using these alternative technologies could provide benefits, eliminate overloads, or avoiding voltage issues without having to build network upgrades. So this is sort of FERC's effort to require transmission providers to look for other solutions than just building upgrades. There are two notable technologies that are not on the list, and that is dynamic line ratings and energy storage options, which both of those are raised on rehearing as things that should have been on the list. Modeling and performance requirements for non-synchronous generating facilities. These are requirements that FERC is trying to accommodate operating capabilities of non-synchronous generators without requiring them to go beyond what they're operationally capable of doing, but at the same time not artificially limiting their output. And so these are just examples of the kinds of things that FERC will require for non-synchronous generators going forward. And here's just a recap of what we just talked about, the key reforms, cluster studies to move projects through, limitations on getting into the queue, staying into the queue to hopefully minimize speculative projects, transmission provider deadlines, requiring technological advancements which could help efficiently interconnect generators without huge network upgrade costs, and a new affected system study process. So compliance procedures. So for existing RTOs that have many of these processes in place already, they may not have much to do in the way of compliance, but I think every transmission provider is going to have to sit down, whether or not they've already made a lot of advancements. They're going to have to go through this whole rule and decide what parts of their current process they want to keep, what parts of their current process conflict with the rule. And if they conflict, can they make a case to FERC that there's a good reason for that? None of the current processes have study penalty, deadline penalties. So that's something FERC's probably going to want to see from all the, even the current RTOs that don't have that. Yep. The Order 2003 established these 3 standards for determining regional flexibility, the consistent with or superior to standard. So if you are, for example, a non-RTO transmission provider and you want to vary from the Order 2023 pro forma, you'll have to show that your proposal is consistent with that or superior to. And for RTOs, they need to just show an independent entity variation. They get a little bit more leeway in making variations to the pro forma process. And there's also a regional difference rationale if reliability requirements require that. So the compliance timeline, as it's currently outlined in the rule, is that the transmission provider compliance filings are due by December 5th. And these compliance filings will consist of the new LGIP, a new LGIA, the small generator interconnection procedures, and the small generator interconnection agreement. Those are going to be very large filings, as you can imagine. Those are due by December 5th. There are several requests now to extend that deadline. FERC hasn't, at least as of today, hasn't acted on those. The transitional clusters, the transition process is to be completed within 150 to 360 days. So that pretty much takes all of 2024 to at least get that transition going. And then the first Order 2023 compliance cluster study process will begin after the transition. So I don't see any of the first cluster studies under Order 2023 beginning before 2025. Here's a little bit more detailed timeline. Key dates, the rule was issued in July. August, 30 days later, a request for rehearing were filed. So the date of publication of the final rule in the Federal Register, September 6th is the date where, from which a lot of the key dates in the rule are geared toward. So for example, the compliance filings, December 5th, that's 90 days from the date of publication of the final rule. A lot of the other dates are geared toward the date of publication in the final rule. So we know those dates because we know the date it was published. The effective date of the final rule is November 5th. And there are other dates that are geared off of the effective date of the final rule. So this is just sort of a handy sheet for you to reference when you're reading the rule and it says it's effective or it's, based on the date of publication. So as an example of the compliance deadline request to extend, EEI has proposed 90 days after FERC issues a substantive order on the rehearings. So that date is up in the air. We don't know when FERC's going to issue that rule. Or 180 days after the rule was published, which would be March 4th. This is just one example. A lot of parties have requested extensions. Request for rehearing. So there are about 30 requests for rehearing. This is a sample of the parties. Some of them filed in groups, so they may not all be listed. But the major issues that are raised, and I bet you can guess the major issue for transmission providers was the study penalties. And here is a sort of a quick summary of the types of arguments that they make. Penalties are an improper imposition of strict liability because the penalties will be imposed on transmission providers even if the transmission providers are exercising good utility practice. So if you think about that, FERC's basic operating standard for transmission entities, for public utilities in general, is good utility practice. So these penalties sort of vary from that because they will be imposing penalties even if a transmission provider can show it was exercising good utility practice. Some parties have argued that the penalties are unlawful monetary damages that are prohibited under the Federal Power Act. They've argued that penalties constitute a regulatory taking. So, because this would be FERC now, a government agency imposing penalties on a company, a private company, without any kind of a hearing or finding of fault until afterwards. They have to then, it's basically you're guilty unless you can show you that you're innocent. FERC, even in the order itself, has said that it has not been presented with any evidence of wrongdoing, bad faith, incompetence, lack of incentives, or any kind of bad acts by transmission providers. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but nobody presented that. And so that's an argument that now that they're using that, well, FERC, you haven't made a case for penalties, so you haven't met the burden of imposing them. Some transmission providers are arguing that penalties could actually be counterproductive because if there are delays, there are study shortages. There are staffing shortages, and that could cause them to have to shift personnel from one utility function to another in order to avoid penalties. It could cause transmission providers to sacrifice quality for speed of studies. And sacrificing quality could then backfire down the road when studies may have to be redone or they weren't accurate. Third-party contractors, if transmission providers hire them, may require all kinds of liability limitation provisions, or they might charge increased rates in order to protect themselves, because if the transmission provider is penalized, they may try to pass it through to contractors. So that's just the flavor of some of the arguments that transmission providers are making on the penalty issue. The advanced transmission technologies, as I mentioned, was another area. FERC should include DLRs and energy storage. Some RTOs, in fact, I think it was SPP that argued they shouldn't have to consider alternative transmission technologies at all because it takes too much time or it adds minimal value to the process. And then there's a whole host of other rehearing requests, clarification requests. All of these won't be decided for a while. FERC will probably issue a rehearing order. It's hard to tell, but it could be 90 days, 120 days or so. The appeals process here, there are 6 separate appeals that have been filed throughout the courts of appeals. These will be consolidated at some point into one of the circuits. I'm not sure where. There'll be a panel of judges that decides where it goes. This appeal process may put some pressure on FERC to issue its rehearing order, but that schedule hasn't been set yet, so we don't know. And that's it. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer.
Given where we're at, and SPP, as I mentioned, is certainly Q has been an issue. So summarizing all of that, I heard 2025, but can you give us any indication of where you think this might have an impact in our part of the country?
Well, SPP has I think recently started a cluster study process. So they're going to have to make a compliance filing, and they'll have to decide what parts of their current process they want to keep, if they want to make changes, if they want to argue to the FERC that the current process is consistent with the Order 2023 requirements. Because they have a process in place, they may not have a transition process. It will really depend on what they do in their compliance filing. Now, in order to submit a compliance filing, their SPP will have to carry out a stakeholder process. So if you all are involved in that stakeholder process, you should get an idea of what the plans are, and you don't have to wait for the actual filing.
At the end of the day, looking at the whole thing, do you think that FERC has accomplished a goal of making the compliance system and kind of the whole process more transparent and more fair? Or do you think that it seems like a very complicated thing to work your way through, and at the end of the day, is this going to be more or less fair to developers and other folks of all different sizes, or not? Is this a step forward or not?
I think it is a step forward for sure. Any interconnection process, even if it's perfect, it's going to be limited by available transmission capacity and the ability to build more transmission. FERC has rules in the process now. They're looking at a transmission planning and cost allocation rule. Depending on how they come out with that, with transmission cost allocation, that could affect the way network upgrade costs are allocated. So it could undo, it could cause the current Order 2023 to need to be revised to be consistent. But I think in order for any interconnection process to work perfectly or in as best as it can, there has to be transmission available, and it has to be you have to be able to build transmission when you need it and where you need it. So I think there is some improvement, though. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Certainly a topic for another day, but that we're familiar with here in Nebraska. Thank you, Linda. I'm sure she's going to be here for the reception.